For today is Dr. Donald Jensen. Dr. Jensen is the Senior Advisor for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Prior to that, he was a Senior Fellow and Editor-in-Chief at the Center for European Policy Analysis. As a former U.S. diplomat, Dr. Jensen provided staff support for the START, INF, and SDI treaty negotiations. So today we would like to talk about Russian disinformation campaigns in Italy. For years, the Kremlin's propaganda machine has been spreading globally and in our country, Italy, has been spreading various strategic narratives aimed at discrediting and delegitimizing liberal democracy and what they call, and we call, open society. So because of all this, intelligence analysts depict a worrisome picture of Italy due to its clear vulnerability to Russian influence. More recently, during the September vote to elect a new prime minister in Italy, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the vice president of the Russian National Security Council, said the following through a message on Telegram, and I quote, "At the ballot box, we would like to see European citizens not only express discontent with the actions of their governments, but also call them to account, punishing them for their blatant stupidity." So this message was obviously directed to the Italian electorate, as Italy was the only country going through a national election. Recently, an interesting investigative piece came out by the OCCRP, and this piece sheds light on a resolution adopted back in 2016 by a regional legislature council in Veneto, which is a northern Italian region, de facto recognizing Crimea's annexation. In the following months after that, Italian local councils in Liguria and Lombardy, again, northern regions in Italy, led by the Lega Nord party, followed with similar resolutions. Why do you think Italy's political scene is so susceptible to Russian influence, and how does this look from Washington?
Well, let me give a realistic and a little bit long answer. We have an expression in sports, boxing: Italy hits below its weight, which is to say, given that it's a rich country, given the high level of literacy and sophistication, all of that stuff, you would expect Italy to play a stronger leadership role in Europe and in the world, frankly. And I say it again, I say this as an Italian American. It did for a while under Draghi, and I don't vote in Italy, so I'm just saying that as an expert. But generally it doesn't. Generally, it defers to, on most issues, to Germany, France, Britain. You know that. Why is that? Well, number one, the internal inefficiencies of the Italian government, which we've talked about. It's very bureaucratic. The huge wealth disparities between the North and the South, all make for internal tension. So Italy gives the impression of not being, as they say, as consolidated as a country as some others might be. Estonia being one that hits above its weight, or Poland. Number one. But there are specific issues with Russia, I think, that make Italy vulnerable. Number one, of course, is during the Cold War, it had a very large communist party, which regularly voted and was seen as particularly legitimate, and then came under various other disguises. And that made, I think, a susceptibility to the Russian point of view. Then the Soviet, that is not the case. Excuse me, even when it was purely a propagandistic point of view. And that's very important. Number two would be, and this is also ironic because Italy is seen here as one of America's best friends. That's number one. Number two, of course, is that money. Italy, I don't want to name names, but you can fill in the blank. Italy has had leaders and parties and other things in a society which can be, I use the C word again, corrupted by external financial flows. That was true during the Soviet Union times, where it was active. It's also true very much today with certain parties and certain leaders. Frankly, finally, I would say that journalistically, I don't, as bad as the US media can be, and it's generally pretty good, but it makes mistakes. I don't think you have you can forgive me for being critical, a strong enough journalistic tradition in Italy to sometimes weed out the Russian propaganda from real news. Now, it's one thing to say, Draghi did this or did not do this, but it's another thing to have a spokesman for the Kremlin, and we all know about the alleged Nazis in Kiev and Lavrov last year in Italy. It's another thing to have a Russian propagandist sitting there and giving the Kremlin line. So when you talk about journalism, you talk about giving all points of view. The Kremlin propaganda line is not a point of view. That's the Kremlin propaganda line. A point of view is whether Mattarella or somebody does this or that, or what does it mean? That's a discussion. This is simply opening your TV studio to Kremlin mouthpieces. And I watch Rai Italia all the time, and I see these crazy talk shows where people say things, and I thought they were bad sometimes in the United States. They say things that aren't even true, and it's taken as legitimate. So you've got to raise, I think, the standards of journalism as well, just as there are many good journalists in Italy, but the public discourse and public debate, I think, is of a character that makes it easier for the Russians to manipulate. But if I want to go back to the money point again, there's good money and there's dark money, and there's no question that certain Italian politicians and parties get Kremlin funding, just like they do in France or Germany. It's the same thing. And that corrupts the system.
Now I want to talk about a specific time period, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Russian propaganda intensified during the height of the pandemic in Italy, with the goal of inciting the no-vax and the no green pass movements in Italy. For those who don't know, the green pass was a document that Italian citizens had to carry around to enter restaurants, public transportation, etc. These movements basically criticized the Italian government for its very restrictive measures and commonly referred to the government as dittatura sanitaria, which literally translates into health dictatorship. And it also accused the government of serving the interests of the global elites, whose ultimate goal is to control the masses. As someone who has lived in Italy through these lockdowns, I can confirm that life was not easy, especially for lower income families and the working class, because they actually had to go outside and go to their offices or do their jobs while everybody else was locked inside their apartments. These categories were hit hard financially and psychologically by the imposed restrictions. How do we know that the anti-government movements were a product of Russian-sponsored disinformation and not merely a natural reaction to the frustration of Italian citizens?
Well, this shows, Julie, this shows the Kremlin's cleverness, because there's both. There's no doubt that people suffered, genuinely suffered, and they had nothing to do with Russian propaganda. There's no doubt that in many countries, and we remember those horrible scenes of the military in Italy when the COVID broke out, there's no doubt that people suffered, and there's no doubt that the government made a lot of mistakes in handling it. However, that's a prime example of how Russia can take misfortune, twist it, focus on the negative, and there was a lot of negative anyway, focus on the negative, twist it into something that would either show Russia in a better light, and Russia was hit very hard by COVID, or show the Russian vaccines in a better light, or undermine even further the Italian government by showing how incompetent they've reacted. So that's one way you could tell, is because the narratives in Moscow are the same as the Russian propaganda. Excuse me, the narratives coming out of Moscow to Italy are the same as some of the narratives going to Estonia or Germany or France. Second, you can also trace the origins of a lot of these memes, a lot of these stories. So it's not very hard to show they come from Russia. And to be honest, Julie, good journalism, fact checking, and every country has its problems there, but certainly Italy does. Fact checking makes a big difference. But you know what? The advantage is still with Russia, because even the best journalists, and I read the Italian press a lot, the best journalists can't refute every bad story. So you, as they say here, you throw the pasta against the wall, and some of it will always stick. And that's what they do. And that's how they took advantage of the COVID situation. Remember how good the Russian vaccine was said to be at the beginning of the crisis. It wasn't. But people don't know. People aren't experts. They tend to believe what they see on TV, and that's what happened here.
So for our last question, I would like to focus on a very recent development, the shipwreck that occurred in Cutro, on the Calabrian coast in the south of Italy, that resulted in the death of at least 86 migrants. The direction of migration flows creates problems that polarize public opinion in democratic countries, that's the United States, but this happens especially in Italy. So polarizing, dividing, and creating rifts of dissidents in Western societies is a technique that at the time the Soviet Union was using, and that is allegedly a technique adopted by Putin as well. Our Italian minister Crosetto recently accused the Wagner Group, the Kremlin-supported mercenary force, of purposely sending migrants towards the coast of Italy to create havoc in the political arena. So my last question is, can we consider this as a cognitive active measure, even though it expresses itself physically?
Yes, but if I could elaborate on this, is a very good example of how Russia works. What is the vulnerability in Italy is the fact that the migrant crisis is overwhelming the country and needs to be taken care of, correct? And that Italy is seen as not being sufficiently supported by Brussels in some of these issues, some of these challenges. So the Kremlin strategists can sit there and see this is a potential to cause, Julie, to cause chaos. Now, it didn't cause the migrant crisis necessarily, although some people even say the original Syrian crisis of immigration was intentionally caused by Russia. It was cognitive. I don't think that's the case, but it doesn't have to be the case. Because what matters is Russia can exploit this to undermine the Italian government and undermine the West, and that's what's happening here. I have no doubt that Wagner probably played a role here. That doesn't mean that Wagner created a crisis. It means some smart guys in Moscow are saying, hey, look at that in Italy. Let's take advantage of it by doing it this way. Because one of the keys to Russian active measures, Julie, is that you don't have to be a Kremlin agent, paid, dressed up in that way. What you have to do is be manipulated by the Kremlin through your own shortcomings, short-sightedness. And that's what the Kremlin does. There are politicians in Italy who do what the Kremlin wants. And they're not even aware that they're doing what the Kremlin wants, but the Kremlin wants to do that. And the Kremlin structures situations to allow them to go in the direction they want without being pushed or visibly seen. And that's what's happening here. Wagner probably just saw an opportunity and took it. And that's why it's very important to be always vigilant about this kind of thing. This is not a Western conspiracy. This is Kremlin active measures, as you say, and they are expert at it. Now, it doesn't always work, but it often does. And you see in Ukraine that no matter how thick Russian propaganda is, people don't believe it anymore. But at this level, with the migrants in Italy, it's a story you can flavor, it's a story you can spin, it's a story you can color in a way that a lot of Italians will believe it, and they go to the polls the next election, they may pick somebody who the Kremlin prefers to the current government. Now, obviously, people have watched, if I can add my own analytical point here, people have watched the current government very carefully and its attitude toward Ukraine, because given the pressures on Italy, financial, economic, and otherwise, we know what she's under, what kind of pressure she's under. So Italy so far is holding the line very well, despite the pressure. So it does have strength, it does have resilience, And we all need to help bolster that to make sure Italy is continues to be on the right side in the crisis.